And I think this is probably the most important one that we don't do enough. Listen. Go out to your teams. Listen. Don't walk around with the senior manager. Don't walk around with the manager that works for you. Go out and just meet the teams and listen. Be careful, because we've been talking about actions as well. Don't start actioning out all of the change to the people and not give your direct reports, the opportunity to engage with you on it. But just listen, stop there and just listen and use that to reinforce what decisions you are making with your team to then drive, I'll say, greater resiliency and output from your organization. That's my one tip. We don't do enough of it.
Hello, listeners and viewers, and welcome to the third episode in our mini-series about resilience. And today we'll be talking about that theme from the perspective of holistic health, wellness, and innovative data-driven approaches to them within the workplace context. So to help me do that, who better than a visionary leader, co-founder of a company doing exactly that work by integrating that cutting-edge technology with the sort of personalized wellness strategy that is necessary for any individual to really get the best out of their health and their well-being at work. His name is Andrew Ronchetto. Really pleased to welcome him on the show today. He brings a wealth of knowledge about these data-driven solutions, about the wellness industry. He's had personal experience with some of these issues himself as well. So it's a really important issue, and it is, of course, super relevant to resilience. And I've no doubt there's plenty of valuable things we're going to learn from this conversation, so stick around.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Well, Andrew, welcome to Leading with Integrity. It is great to have you on the show.
Yeah, David, thanks for having me. I'm excited about what we're going to talk about today. So just happy to be here and ready to talk through it with your listeners.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, we're doing a themed month on resilience, and I think your story and what you do as well has a lot of relevance to that. So I'm sure you're going to have loads of stuff to talk to us about. First thing, though, really is tell us a bit about yourself. What's your background? What do you do? Why do you do it?
Yeah. I think it's crazy how life evolves very rapidly sometimes. And about 2 or 3 years ago, was just deep into my work. We're going to talk about resiliency. So it's how do you just keep pushing through? And I think we can all appreciate sometimes we go a little bit too far in work and need to pull it back. But, that happened to me, and I was going really far, really long for a number of months. I was just out of balance and everything else in my life. And I actually got hurt. And as I was going through my recovery and working with various practitioners and coaches and whatnot, what came to realize or materialize for me is I felt like a traffic cop. And if you can kind of relate to that, it's how you pass information to everybody, how you try to make sense of what they're saying so then you can express your own opinion just on what it'll work for you, but then also be able to articulate that to other people. And all the meanwhile, it's wait a second, this is my recovery. And so it started to get me deeper into just these aspects of what helps us create balance in life, what helps us, to the point of our conversation, be more resilient, be able to move through things. Well, how do we recognize or start to recognize when we're out of balance and then actually consciously do something about it? And I wasn't doing that, even though I had family and friends dude, you need to slow down. I just wasn't. And I think it was just because of this personal mental state of what it is. And so as I got deeper into this, we, not just realizing that we needed something more in a time of crisis, so to say, and at a time of recovery, but also that we could really back it up and be more preemptive rather than reactive. And that became the basis of what Beyond is. for us and for the world, this idea that I can be on, I can be intentional, I can be engaged and purposeful. So it starts to kind of bring in all these other dimensions of who you are, and then create a space to look at all of them, define journeys, and get after the macro aspect of being conscious of your practices, of what you're going after, how you prioritize all of that, kind of all in one space, something that really didn't exist yet. And this ability then to use that to bring others into your own journeys while you stay at the center. So I know I packed a lot into that, but just really redefining our relationship with technology and redefining the way we look at it and being a lot more intentional about what really helps us. And in doing that, look at our actions and how they're more meaningful, look at how we create energy off of that, how we be more authentic with ourselves, and ultimately how we just make decisions easier. So a lot of things can be baked into creating that visibility and that consciousness. And that's what we're going after at Beyond. And we're really excited to share that because it's something it's kind of hard sometimes to think about, like how you do this. So it's been an exciting ride over the last 2 years, and where we're molding and shaping really to help folks, but then expand that by integrating practitioners, like I was saying, into the conversation, and ultimately even just driving it into organizations. Because if you didn't know this, like career is, not just a third of our life. We all know that part. For some of us, it's more. For others, maybe they get lucky and it's less, but it's also a dimension of holistic wellness. And so when it is out of balance, we can, as humans, I'll say flex, but ultimately we're passing the buck down the road to that it's going to catch up with us at one point in time. So as we can start looking at all this together, it really helps us start to reframe what makes us more resilient rather than, paying for it down the road. So Beyond and what we're doing there is really all about this, and why we're, having that conversation about resiliency, because it's baked into the whole nature of life.
Absolutely. And I think in the workplace in particular, it's one of those things, isn't it? Like it's like mental health as well, that aspect of it. Like it's always been important in the workplace, but it's not always got the attention it deserves. Yes. I think that hopefully is starting to change now, not least because of the work that you guys are doing as well, and companies like you, people like you. So when we think about burnout, and again, like we talked about that a lot last year on the podcast, it's something where you're so right when you say people put it off and it just catches up with you later. It comes back to bite you in the proverbial. And we talked about that in our pre-conversation, didn't we, in the context of retirement and people just falling off that cliff as soon as they stop working.
Yeah.
I think so. Where I'm getting to, I'm going all over tangents here, but where I'm getting to is in the modern workplace. I think so often we talk about the curse of the mobile phone and social media and these technologies that are ever present and make it impossible to switch off. But from your perspective, actually, technology can help in this sphere. So, how do you see that play of technology in filling that gap between these like traditional approaches to what we might think is the way forward, and then innovations in health and wellness in the modern sphere? And then how does that then further relate to workplaces? Big question.
I'm probably gonna take it from the angle of like workplaces and back it into everything.
Okay, great. Yeah.
And part of this, I think, for me is because, workplaces are still catching up. Companies are still trying to catch up in this. And even though I'll say folks like ourselves are talking about how you move wellness, well-being, engagement out of this kind of, I'll say, after hours perk or benefit to being a part of the organization. And really the way we talk about it is this idea of how do you incorporate it into the actual business strategy and operations of the company? And people are like, well, we already do that. I'm like, hear me out. I'm not talking about doing yoga in the middle of the day here. I'm talking about like how we actually evaluate initiatives against the human element, our employees, our people, and not to say that it slows us down or we don't blaze trails, but what does it mean to do that? And some of that starts with the reframing of the conversation from an executive level. So I had met a guy a while back, and he was talking about, the biggest thing he's learned to do as a leader is be more vulnerable. And I think there's an element of vulnerability in here that's so fundamentally key to helping engage with the organization, in part because what it allows you to do is, I think, had to say, reach across the aisle. You'd hope it's not like we're on two sides of the same company, but sometimes it's that way. Like the flexibility executives have, or the passion or the motivation or the authority, the empowerment that they have is sometimes different than anybody else in the organization. And so the way they use that and flex that muscle is different. If they show up at 10 o'clock, people probably aren't complaining. But if, you're early on in your career and you're showing up at 10 o'clock, somebody's thinking, twice. So part of this is helping create vulnerability for executives. And in doing that, what we're really trying to say is, what does it mean to introduce a new initiative? And what is the impact to the true impact to your people? Because, we hear it all the time. Well, this will be a more efficient process. So we'll be able to get more and more, 10% savings. And it's like, now I do more work. And now I got to put it into 3 systems instead of 2 systems. And now I got to talk to 5 people and get 10 sign-offs. And meanwhile, it did the exact opposite most of the time than what we really hear. So bringing the human element into business strategy and operations is, I think, so fundamental to building resiliency and helping well-being for individuals. Now, what that then translates into is really some of the things I was mentioning as we were kind of getting off here is, how do I, as an organization, help you grow? And that might sound like, why? You're here to do a job for me. But I'm going to challenge you to say growth can mean a lot of things. So there's a spectrum of it. And sometimes that growth is just in the ability to do the job more efficiently. Or sometimes it is in the ability to, be able to be a resource for other individuals within the same job. So this idea that growth isn't just purely about, I'm learning a new skill, that might be a part of it, but it is also about how I can show empathy and support for others. It's how we can connect as a team, and how all of this really starts to magnify the outcomes we're trying to drive towards. So again, the thought of well-being and engagement being critical to the business is critical because the human element is probably your biggest asset for most people. You can't run a manufacturing line. Some people are doing it, but let's be real. Not everybody's doing it with robots these days. You can't run your operations team purely on AI agents, all the rage in 2025, It's just not going to happen because there's just so much on the back end. And it doesn't mean jobs won't evolve because of automation, because of AI. It's been around for a while. It just means that people are growing to, I'll say, reset the expectation of what it means to do work in that newer world. And again, that is where leaders can really set the tone to create the space for individuals to do stuff here. And I think that is a fundamental key element. Now, why this all kind of comes back to the individuals, we see this as really 3 concentric circles of growth. And growth needs to be based in balance or harmony, and it needs to really drive towards your own why in life, the things that bring you to wake up, the things that make you present in the day, the things that, help you show up to others the way you want to be showing up for yourself. And so there's this automatically bringing it back to the things that are most important to me. And as we do that and that focus on that for the individual, and we amplify that through coaching or advisors or mentors and whatnot, both in companies and outside of companies, and then we apply that actually within our organization, we can magnify the way it impacts our culture, the way it, pushes out into the organization because maybe we volunteer, the way it comes into other employees' families and friends and those relationships. So there's just a lot of different ways of looking at growth and what it means to focus on the individual because of the ripple effect that occurs through those relationships. So for me, it's fascinating to think about how critical well-being is in the workforce because of just all these different dynamics. We just haven't thought as much about it. And we do need to start thinking more about.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of good points in there to pick up on. I mean, there's what I really like is this idea of like operationalizing the wellness, because I think not everyone, but a lot of leaders, a lot of managers, it's too easy for us to forget that actually all of these important things that we're talking about and all these goals we have and the outputs and so on and so on, none of it really happens without those people. And you're right, like any business, what's the biggest asset? It's the people. So if you're not looking after that asset, like even if we're being like really like managerial and mercenary about it, it's an asset that you need to maintain, isn't it? And there's two kinds of maintenance. There's preventative and corrective. Yep. Preventative is usually cheaper. So let's do it that way. That's my point of view.
Not usually massively cheaper. Like, I mean, I'm just going to do this, some rough math on the back of a napkin, but one of your biggest costs is healthcare, especially when it comes to employees. Did you know that so much of healthcare today, and I'm taking it more from a U.S. angle, and I realize it can be different around the world and whatnot. So I do try to appreciate that a little bit, but a lot of healthcare today, because it is so reactive, the cost of healthcare premiums and what those healthcare premiums are associated to is driven by chronic elements. So chronic means we're way past the point of, being able to be preventative at that point. It has really instilled itself. And so, if that is a substantial cost for you, companies focusing on preventative measures, bringing it into the operations can save you quite a bit of money. I mean, sometimes upwards of 30% in that space alone, let alone you start thinking about burnt somebody out and now I need to hire somebody else because they've left or whatever the reason might be that they're no longer with you. Those costs of bringing somebody in can be 200, 300, even 400% based on like the role and level and skill set of the cost of just keeping the person you have and not burning them out, not stressing them out and helping build resiliency. So the cost can blow through the roof and it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. But the reality is this is where we're doing a disservice to ourselves and our organizations because we just kind of disregard those elements, even though they're so substantially embedded in our ability to be profitable. So, I mean, you say like, we're going to be, mean about it and we're going to talk about money, but like companies are there to make money. And I accept that. But there are also companies that make money and change the world. There's a lot of things that can come out of it. The point being is they have to be sustainable themselves and they can't be if they're not also taking care of their people.
Absolutely. I see it as two sides of the same coin. If one side of it, if the money, if that's all you care about, then you've got to recognize that the people deliver that money and that's not going to happen without them. On the other hand, if you're, I suspect like we are, and the people are the more important thing, then equally you've got to recognize, well, how do I look after those people? How do I afford to keep them going and to make sure they're well and they're valued and all of these things? Sadly, it's the other side of the coin. It's the money. So, it's not either or. You've got to have both, haven't you? And so on the healthcare side of it, I mean, even in places like the UK where we have nationalised healthcare and it's free at the point of use, I think is the phrase. You still have, as companies, as employers, you've still got other costs. So like time is the big one, lost productivity, someone's off sick, especially if it's something that's preventable because of the way you haven't looked after them. So stress, for example, would be a big one there, wouldn't it? And then, if the worst happens and they go or the sickness is too long term and it's just not sustainable, you've lost that productivity, that employee for good, then there's still a cost to replacing them. I think it's like 300% or something of their salary was the last one I saw. It might be up to 350 now. I mean, that was a year or two ago. So there's a massive cost there. And again, there's your time to find the right person to replace them and train them up and all of that lost productivity in the meantime. So yeah, I mean, it's got to be cheaper, hasn't it, to just look after people in the first place, to give them access to the kind of services like what you're providing I mean, there's mental health first aid is a big thing now as well, which is, I think, a positive move. I think that's something that a lot of companies are recognizing the value of it. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent again. I'm on the soapbox, but
No, but let me kind of hit on that a little bit here, because I think there is one slight nuance that really needs to come out is, when I get a scrape or something, and I'm saying that on the simple side, I can just put a Band-Aid over it and, we can move on. The thing about, we touch on mental health, for example. The thing about mental health is creating a safe environment to have that conversation is much more than just having somebody available. It is an amazing start, but there's a lot of psychological elements to it. They're part of the company. Is this going to impact my job if I share something with them? Who are they potentially sharing stuff with? Like, there's 1,000 questions that come out of that. And really what it boils down to, is going to be implementation in any company, irrespective of whether it's, a regulatory thing or not. But it comes back to some key things of, as leaders, what's the type of culture we're trying to build? How does that influence the way I am present? So the vulnerability aspect of how far I come with you, how that, along with transparency, it drives trust, and all of that then helps us start to shape this conversation. So I think it is slightly, I love the move and whatnot. I think it could almost feel more as a regulatory requirement to stay out of jail, so to say, unless companies really embrace the other factor of it is, what can I now do with it? Not because I have to, but because I want to. And through that, actually get the biggest benefit from it by helping people. I think that's the part that maybe we're oversimplifying when we think about just adding a benefit like that. And really, like I was saying earlier, shifting it over into the way we operate in a company is where we see the dividends, where we see it move from the reactive to the proactive. So.
Absolutely. No, it's a great point. And yeah, I mean, you're right. Of course, it's always the challenge, isn't it, about regulation versus just doing the right thing. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right as well about the mental health side of it. And a lot of people maybe would be uneasy about saying anything to their manager. To be fair, I think that's probably true with a lot of physical and other medical and chronic conditions as well. People may not, unless they have no choice because there's no hiding from it, they maybe don't want to tell their manager. They don't want that judgment. They don't want to risk their job, as they might see it. And again, completely understandable. Being flippant, I would say maybe that says a lot about the culture of where you're working. If you're worried about telling your manager that you're sick,
Absolutely.
But
yeah, no, 100%. It totally comes to transparency. It's that bi-directional thing. So absolutely. I mean, there's so much baked into that, like we've been talking about it. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting and maybe a little bit depressing these days is when things are difficult economically, I think these issues become much more difficult. I think people feel a lot more self-conscious, a lot more worry, a lot more added stress about talking about this kind of thing openly at work because, yeah, I mean, there's so much pressure, isn't there? Like the economy, the way it is, I can't afford to risk my job and that sort of thing. And then the managers, the bosses, in inverted commas, they will be a lot more worried about the bottom line than they might be otherwise. And yeah, so it all gets a lot more fraught, doesn't it, at these uncertain times, let's call them.
Yeah, but I sometimes I got to put some context around that because I've been through this just like everybody else. And one of the things that I'll say is we're in one wave of uncertain times. And the moment it feels like we get out of it, 3 months later, we're back in another wave. It's like this perpetual state of fatigue and belief that something is just impacting us in a negative way. And it's self-reinforcing, in the sense of I'm always cost cutting or I'm always, prioritizing one thing over another. And I think part of this is reframing the conversation a little bit because as humans, like I said, we can flex and we do flex all the time. The way we handle stress in a day is our ability to flex that muscle, so to say. But part of this for me is when you think if you're constantly flexing, again, you're pushing that angle, that dimension of well-being further than it probably needs to be in terms of the broader context of what creates balance and harmony for yourself and for your employees. And so constantly asking people to flex that muscle, I think has gotten us into the state of constant burnout and stress and work that we're experiencing today. And we're kind of at our limit with it in the sense of there's no more than we can do except to reset. And now where it's like, it's an abrupt, like hit in the face reset and reflection on all of it in order to do it. So I think part of like what we're talking about here is, look, I get it. Things are challenging. And like I said, you have to be able to sustain the business. I mean, as a manager, as an executive, that is your number one goal. But then how far after that in your priority list is the well-being of your people? And sometimes I think it gets a little too far down on the list to the point where it is at the point of being detrimental, like it is in a lot of experiences that people have today. So I think it's consciously as executives saying, how do we move that up the priority list while still driving towards what is critical for us? And it's, I think it's so important more now because the other thing that is employees are pushing back. Like, yes, we can talk about all the trends happening in work. And I think those are more not the root cause of a situation, but more symptoms or, reactions to the situation that's going on. But the point being is, if you were to take it from a generational perspective, the younger generations coming into work don't have that same level of, I'm going to say, affinity to the organization that I'll say generations before them came. And that could be for a lot of reasons, but I think we've all kind of experienced the burn when somebody just disregards it or makes us feel like we're a number. And all of this, I'll say, like I said, it's just something that we have to deal with down the road. And the point I'm bringing up is I don't think the road is 20 years down the conversation of fixing this is 20 years down the road. I think it's 2, most 3 years down the road before you have to start dealing with these types of things now. And there are massive ramifications for it. And it hurts everybody at the end. So my point being is, we're all thinking more and more about what is important for me in my life. And especially it's becoming more prominent as more individuals join the workforce, and it's pushing out some of those older items. It doesn't mean we lose what we are getting from, I'll say, older generations. I think there are a lot of qualities that we're not taking into the workforce to help build resiliency, which is how I learn across the 4 generations in the workforce right now, because they're uniquely different in the way they look at it. And we're not doing enough to like lean even into that, almost to take all of that and not just take all the lessons and pass them down type of thing. But I mean, truly lean into say, how can I build a diversity of thought within my organization that helps me in a competitive advantage way, because I'm using kind of the whole spectrum, and it's really helping me drive in ways, and through culture in the organization, expose everybody to it, but drive in ways that really push us ahead of our competitors. So I think there's a lot baked into what it means to just get after it.
Yeah, and it is a complex one, isn't it? So, I mean, you were talking about a reset. I was thinking back to when I first entered the workplace. It was immediately like months after a credit crunch and mortgage markets and all sorts, financial services falling out all over the world. The first job I got, it took me it was probably 18 months to find a full-time job. I then stayed in that job for a decade. And I think in hindsight, it's because I spent so long looking and I was so worried about what was going on at the time that bought loyalty for 10 years effectively, because I didn't want to risk it again. Now, this is a what if, and it's a hypothetical, and it's impossible to really know the answer. But
Sure.
had I been doing that during, say, COVID, the elephant in the room, the pandemic, or had I just got that job and then got furloughed or lost it because the company went out of business because everything was shut, I don't know. I think maybe that loyalty aspect might just have not existed for me, because, and I can certainly sympathise, if not empathise, with a lot of the people in that later generation who went through that. They, especially if it was like their first job and then it's gone because of COVID. I can understand why they have a totally different perspective on things like loyalty and how long you stay in a job and things like that. Although actually, I think the short service in each company, I think that was happening before COVID, wasn't it? Especially in tech and industries like that.
Yep.
The turnover has been a lot higher for a while, but COVID probably compounded it, shall we say. And I do find it interesting. So you talked about a reset. Do you think the pandemic and the post-pandemic world, do you think that was a missed opportunity to have that reset? Or did it actually happen? Is it still happening?
I'm going to lean towards the latter. I think it's still happening, but what it did was create the awareness, the fact that it is now going to happen. Like almost like we can no longer push ourselves past it. And I think, every company went through it differently. Every individual went through it differently. And it's I'm going to say it's a very personal experience. Even though we all, are able to relate with one another, our experience on it could be radically different from, one person to the next, just sitting in the same room. And I think that in itself can create some loneliness, because it's hard to sometimes always relate, and we might brush it off to say, oh yeah, I remember that. And now we kind of laugh about it, even though that sounds weird, to even bring that up, and that, laugh about tragedy, but it's almost like a coping mechanism to what we experienced. The reason why I say that and bring it up is that's why I feel like we're still going through the reset, because some companies, not all, and it varied, is they went into survival mode. Now, some companies' survival mode, we look at consultancies, it was scale up to the nth degree and bring as many people in because everybody's asking us what to do. And it's like, well, we don't know what we're doing. Like, we're in this with you, but you're asking us, we can make some money off of it. So let's go. Like a different aspect of survival because of a very different industry versus other industries that were furloughing and were, sending people home or giving them the pink slip, and a very different experience in that situation. And the point is that survival now has caught up with those companies, because I'm going to use an example. Back in the 80s, when oil and gas, I've done a lot of my career in consulting has been in oil and gas, and they've been through a lot of waves. And whether you like the industry, hate the industry is not the point here. The point I'm bringing up here is, as they've gone through these waves, one of the things I've felt they have started, and probably jump started in the 80s when they were going through the way that I'll say that crisis of the industry, is they realize they just can't lay off people because times are bad. So in the 80s, when they hit a rough spot, they just got rid of all of their upstream exploration folks. And these are the geologists. These are the folks telling you where to drill. Kind of important for a company that, that makes money by drilling into the earth. And when it was time to start, I'll say, scaling back up in production and whatnot, there was just a whole, I'm going to say, generation of workers that are like, peace out. I'm going to drive the bus. I'm going to do whatever I'm doing now because I just don't want to go back to what it is. Yeah, I could make great money. I could do this. I could ... But I'm happier now. And all of a sudden, these organizations had a different crisis on their hands. They thought it would just, people would come flooding back, and they didn't. So all the intention of this example is to say, yeah, we can go and take some extreme steps, and sometimes we have to, and it is hard, and it is in the moment. So until hindsight's always 20/20 in here. But the point I'm bringing up by using that example is to say how important employees were in that moment, created a ripple effect afterwards that they couldn't easily recover from. They did, of course. We've all seen it. but it was less, I'm going to say, simple than they expected it to be. And this is kind of my point, even for the, coming back to the pandemic, it's like we haven't always learned it there because these consulting companies scaled up and then everything started to, now money wasn't as flush because a lot of governments were just pumping money into the economy to keep things afloat. Now that money is kind of dissipating, going away. These consulting companies aren't seeing the attrition they're expecting. So now they're like, well, now we got to start cutting. So they took something to take an immediate need. So, to address an immediate need, but it really fundamentally down the road left them with something they needed to clean up. And it's the opposite of what I used in my example, but they're both very similar to the situation of how the human element of your company is so critical to what you're doing and how you're doing it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a parallel there, the oil and gas story you told, to like the hospitality and entertainment industry, isn't there, during the pandemic? Certainly in this country, I think there were quite a few. I mean, there's a well-known national chain here, and the guy who owns it, he's got a bit of a reputation. But he made the headlines for like just such an uncaring statement at the height of it all, saying, I don't care, if people we can't sustain them in the business anymore. They can go and stack shelves in the supermarket for all I care, or something to that effect. And it's very similar because it's like the assumption that people will have short memories and that once this current crisis is past, they'll all come flooding back. Of course they won't. Of course they're going to remember this. They'll remember the way they were treated when times were tough. And I think that's the time to double down on the people, isn't it? That's when people are going to be looking for real leadership, for support for this kind of initiative, and to feel looked after. And if you get it wrong, don't expect they'll forget it by next week, next month, even next decade, frankly. It sticks with you. I mean, you're absolutely right.
and I don't want people to like listen to this and be like, well, you don't understand. I think what I'm trying to get at is we're looking backwards at it. And that has a degree of ability for us to reflect. I think what you're hitting on is the culture of a company. It can be lost in the moment, but the ability to build that culture, refine it, to build trust within it takes a lot. And so balancing that out is a very tricky thing for any executive, for any manager. And don't get me wrong. I mean, getting through the pandemic, something none of us have ever experienced before. Especially in the modern age, so to say, it required a different level of thinking, and some came out on the right side, some came out on the wrong side. And so I think there's also, I'm not going to say I agree with the executive, like in your example and whatnot, but just that, he did it because that's what he believed in, is his answer or response to it. And we're looking back on it saying, well, dude, probably not. And I think it's just that's where that lack of empathy wasn't there to help drive resiliency within his own organization. Like it just went a step too far. I think everybody would have appreciated what he was doing until he made that comment.
Possibly. Yeah, it's difficult. So, I mean, given some of the context at the time when our government was one of the ones offering a lot of financial support, specifically to keep people in their jobs, even if they couldn't actually work. So there were those options available to any business in the country, which, whether or not he chose to take that, I don't know. That bit didn't make the headlines, funnily enough. I think for me, where he went wrong was the public statement and the lack of kindness and empathy for those people. Because, at the end of the day, there's business decisions in those crisis moments that you have to take. And yes, everyone's going to make a mistake sooner or later, especially when they're under that kind of pressure. So that bit of it, we can forgive, probably.
Yeah, and that's really, I think that's really where I'm trying to go with it, is like, maybe it was just too many steps too far. Yeah. In that particular statement. And, it's that, what is it, open your mouth, insert foot type of moment. But except now it is across social media and whatnot. And I think this is part of the challenge and the for leaders in building resiliency in their own organizations, irrespective of whether you're in the middle of a crisis, because, that moment of, open mouth, insert foot can happen at any point in time. I know I've had those experiences, and it's like, nope, just zip it up, just leave it go, maybe just come back to it. And the point being here is like, you can't take that back, even if you wanted to at that point. And that has ramifications on your team and the organization and the well-being and the engagement and the culture, all these things that help drive resiliency within your business. So, they're very intangible items. It's not like I can say, well, if I then do these 5 things, check the boxes quantitatively, I will now be better. And this is the struggle, I think, in business and investing in well-being more, is that the quantifiable benefits vary greatly by organization for lots of soft and qualifiable elements. And we always, the finance person, the CFO, accounting person coming in saying, well, we can't do this because it doesn't have a positive ROI. It's like, well, ROI is financial, guys. Like, are you telling me that I'm never going to, invest in my people, invest in their learning, and how I quantify the fact that they took one more learning, therefore means, 100x return on the way I operate within the business? Like, it's a lot harder to justify it. And we've gotten so stuck into this justification aspect of, we do anything based on that. And it's been hard as we have the conversations with companies. It's like, well, what's my X return? I'm like, well, it's going to depend on you. Like, I could give you a range, but that range is going to be so big. You're going to be like, well, that range is so big. What's mine? Like, I already know the answer that you're going to come up. So anyway, like, it does matter what executives are saying. And like in that example we're talking about, they just went too far, and it had a detrimental impact on the organization and the focus on people, which we find so important.
Yeah. I mean, not to overanalyze it, but the word, I think, I don't know what the answer to those situations is necessarily, but I choose to believe that a big part of that is what you were saying right back at the beginning about vulnerability. Because I think so many leaders in that situation, they get stuck in that sort of, is it unfair to call it an old-fashioned mindset? I don't know, but this kind of must project strength, show everything as well. I'm a trustworthy, decisive, decision-making person. And that, I think, is the start of that slippery slope that leads them into these, not the best way of handling it.
No, for sure. And I don't even know that it's a more traditional approach, so to say. I think it's a mentality that we expect leaders, managers, whatever term you want to use in the moment, to exude this confidence that they know the answer. And when they don't, all panic comes to forth. It's like, the world's ending, because you don't know. And it's like, I'm literally living it with you at the same moment. Like, and I'm trying to provide as much information as possible. Sometimes, it's not always the case, but the point being here is like, you're right. Vulnerability can help build that, but you can't do it in the moment. It's got to be something. It's a preemptive fact, actually. Like, you got to do it before that, because when you need it in the moment, it's already too late. And I have this experience working on various projects, and, I've done a lot of work for, I'll say, organizational transformations, in the sense of maybe we're fundamentally changing an organization. Maybe we're divesting or acquiring. Like, there's a lot of emotion that happens in each of those in very different ways. And unless you've been through it, not just been a part of it, executing, so to say, but been through it yourself, you can't really begin to appreciate what people are going through in those moments. And the reason why I bring that up is what has made the teams I've worked with most successful in those situations, especially from a person coming from the outside saying, hey, look, I'm here because of this. The first thing, we had to do was find ways to build trust. And the fastest way I found to do that was through being vulnerable and being transparent. And transparency, I would say, probably came first, and then vulnerability, in the sense that I'm going to give it all to you, and I'm going to lay it out straight, and we're going to tell you why we're doing what we're doing. And I'm going to be direct about it, not just, maybe let me get back to you. Like, no, I'm going to tell you how it is based upon where we're at this moment, because these are the types of things that tend to move quickly and evolve pretty rapidly. So it's never feels constant in those experiences. But the point being is because we were transparent, then we could start to share vulnerability from our side of like, well, how is this impacting and what do we do for you, to then build the trust to move forward. That meant to execute, that meant to deliver, that meant to be successful as a team, to come together as a team, all these other dynamics that help build a culture. And in that case, having to build a culture overnight, so to say, in order to be successful. So it does matter how a manager or a leader comes forward. And like I said, sometimes we just need to insert our foot in our mouth a little bit more and stop while we're ahead.
Yeah. But I mean, you're right as well. It's if you got to the moment and you haven't done it already, it's too late. It's got to be part of that culture, hasn't it? Almost, yeah, like preempting the problem, I suppose. But yeah, I so agree with you on transparency as well. Because people know, like, if you're not telling them something, they pick up on it. Like, it's not subtle, is it? It's not. Secrets don't stay secret as easily as we hope they do sometimes, I think.
Well, and I think a great example of this is, when Amazon was starting to push out their 5-day-a-week return to office, and the employees were so vocal backwards of like, show me the data, like use the Amazon way to justify for me why you're doing this. And it was almost like crickets. And then like, arbitrary comments coming back of like, well, I walked around the office and a whole bunch of people were really excited about this. And you're like, because they knew if they said anything to like you can see how their brains turn in here. Like if I say something bad, because he's walking away, he's gonna be like, okay, that guy, he's next.
Yeah, but also, I mean, they're the ones that are already in the office, so they must have some level of comfort with it first.
Yeah, but it almost like it's this reinforcement bias, so to say, of, yeah, it was a good decision because all these people around me said it was, even though I'm not really maybe getting a diversity of thought within the situation. And so I think that was, I used, and I brought that up because I think this is where we start to say, to your point, people knew. Like this had nothing to do with, what they were articulating to be the benefits, even though I would argue some of those benefits will come from it, but they weren't the primary factors driving the decision. And this is where that transparency, or lack thereof really fundamentally deteriorates trust, in the blink of an eye, like we were talking about.
I'm trying to remember that there's a famous quote, isn't there, about trust and how it takes like years to build and you can lose it in a second. And I can't remember who it was. I feel like it was like Benjamin Franklin or somebody like that. It's that sort of era, isn't it? I don't know. I'm going to have to look that up.
I'll have to pull up my history book to figure that one out.
I'll Google it afterwards. And, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We've sort of been circling around this concept of resilience, haven't we? And I think now is as good a time as any. Like, how do you define that word? What is resilience? What's it about?
For me, I think there is a few elements to it, and it depends who we're talking about resiliency with. So if I'm talking to you, David, as an individual, what it means to have resiliency in your life, I think it's about the ability for you to have balance and harmony across everything that's going on and everything you're trying to do that, I'll say helps you get up in the morning, the why factor of your life and how you get after that. So it's, sometimes our resiliency on a personal level is impacted. We had a bad day. And that's where I think one of the most important things we've kind of also been circling the drain on a little bit, but haven't said is connection with other individuals. And in that case, for an individual, it be family, it be friends, but also in the workplace, it can be colleagues and whatnot. But connection and relationships are sometimes just that little bit of what's needed to help us get us out of that rut. And so resiliency for me is really an understanding and appreciating, creating balance and harmony within life to go after the things that are most important, bring you back to your why, the things that give you energy, the things that make all your actions meaningful, the things that help you be your authentic self and make decisions more quickly. It really is, resiliency is about bringing that forward. And an enterprise and an organization, resiliency for me is an extension of that. It's almost a magnification aspect of it, in the sense that whether, we're going to experience these ups and downs like we've been talking about over the course of the episode. How do I make it feel less like a roller coaster and more just like the kiddie ride? And for me, that is what I would say is the way to look at resiliency within the organization, because it doesn't mean we're not going to have these ups and downs as an organization, but the things we do to build resiliency into our teams, like the clarity we can have in our roles and responsibilities. And it's amazing. You can have the conversation to say, here's what I was hired for. Here's what my manager told me to do. And here's what I'm actually doing. And the three things don't connect with each other. It's very hard to build resiliency in that just one example, because you're stressed out about all the things that were said, and not everybody's with you day to day. So if an executive comes in and says, well, this is your job to be doing, you're like, yeah, but everybody's got me doing something else. I mean, there's stress in there. It's just it's not healthy. But the flip side of that, or, another example of that is in, sustainable operations from a people perspective. Resiliency in that, your operations is about creating support mechanisms for teams, for individuals when they need additional flex. We kind of put our rigid boxes around every department and say that, stay in your lane, so to say. But the ability for the entire organization to understand and move as one is a key element of resiliency. If I'm going through and, I'm a technology company and I'm pushing an update on the weekend, rather than me just having to automatically say, hey, make sure we get an email out, make sure we, make this notification, ... Do we need to change privacy policies? Right now, that's what happens a lot in organizations. It's more of a push rather than a pull. And so there's a lack of flex and support in there to create sustainable operations, because these other groups aren't, I'm going to say, pulling themselves the things that are happening so that they can execute their specific responsibilities. So resiliency in an organization is about creating that harmony across teams to work in a more seamless fashion, because they know, hey, we're pushing an update, which means we need to notify people, which means marketing's maybe engaged, or customer service is engaged, which means I'm going to update our website. And these things just come naturally because it's a part of how we've built the organization and the culture to really help everybody thrive in that particular example.
I like both of those definitions, I have to say. I think it's becoming one of those buzzwords, isn't it? I think resilience. I don't know what the word of the year was last year, but I feel like this year it might be resilience. It's early to call it, I know. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 11 months. But anyway, so I think part of being more resilient has to start with understanding what it is and what it means. And there's so many bad definitions, incorrect, unhelpful definitions. That's probably the best word, isn't it? Unhelpful.
Too simple.
Or too simple, yeah. So, thinking back to, when I first entered the workforce, I don't think resilience was even on the radar, but it was one of those things that became sort of, it got tied up, I think, in that hustle culture, that sort of the not so helpful entrepreneur sort of mindset. And it just became this, well, you're resilient because you work all the hours, you keep going even when, your arm's falling off or whatever. and nothing will stop you from working, no matter the stress or the time. And that means you're a resilient person. You're a great worker. Well done. And I don't think that's what it is at all. That's super unhelpful. But even today, I still have that stuck in the back of my mind sometimes, and it can be really difficult to shake those old mindsets as well. So, I mean, my next question for you is variation on that theme, really. What do you think is the biggest myth about resilience?
That it is a simple thing. I took and started a monologue of describing resiliency a moment ago. Part of my reasoning for that was because, one, it is hyper personalized, at the individual level. But when you bring it into an organization, where somebody is individually is where they're going to be in the organization as well. And so whether they have that support community, whether they have the ability to be vulnerable with others or to trust others, it is, in a simple way or simpler way in our own lives, but then amplified and magnified within the organization. So I think sometimes making the definition of resiliency simple to try to help people understand is partly where there's a challenge, because we need that connection with other people to be resilient, to help us push through those moments, to help us be accountable. But what that looks like in our personal life and what it looks like in a corporate or, career scene are similar but different. And I think we have to appreciate those nuances to really get after the true meaning of it.
Yeah, I think that individual context, it's such an important point. And I see a parallel to leadership there as well.
Absolutely.
Because, it's the people you're leading, isn't it? So, so somebody who went through burnout last month is probably not as resilient right now as somebody who didn't, for example. And then from the leadership perspective, if you don't know your people well enough, you're never going to know that. So you might give them both the same bit of work and one of them will get it done tomorrow and the other will never finish it. And yet if you're judging them on that same standard because you don't know that context, you haven't taken the time to get to know your people and know what their needs are. Yeah, great lesson for leaders as well.
And you're setting the tone for your own culture. So, absolutely. I mean, a flip side of that is in the way you come forth into your work as a leader is the way, whether you believe it or not, whether you tell people or not, is the way other people are going to come in. So if you're burning the midnight oil, your people are going to burn the midnight oil because they feel like that is what they have to do to be successful. And I've seen that, and I've really, because I've done it. And as many times as I say, I don't need you to burn the midnight oil, there's a flip side of it, which is I'm telling you to work less, to focus less on a passion of yours. Like, you're burning the midnight oil because there's something about it that makes you want to do that. And instead of celebrating it, I need to put some guardrails on it. But instead of celebrating it, I'm almost condemning you for it. Like saying, you shouldn't be doing that. Like, go to sleep. Like, as if, so my point being here is this is complex. This goes back to what we've been talking about. Like, to build resiliency in an organization is not just, it is how we come forward, but it's also in the way we interact with people. It's the way we talk with people. It's how we are vulnerable. It's how we are transparent. It's how we build trust. But also it's in those actions too, to say, when I tell you, like, stop working, what am I actually doing in that moment that I'm trying to be a good steward, so to say, but really what I'm telling you is I want you to care less.
Yeah, that's a difficult
think about that for a moment and what that means for resiliency. Light bulb a little bit here of how important it is in the words we use just to help people continue to be passionate about what they're doing and bring that into work. Yeah,
it is a tough one. And again, it's an individual thing. It's very personal. Everyone will be at a different point on that spectrum, on that scale of it. I've seen organizations where probably the most challenging one was where we had both of those problems. So you had people within the organization who were genuinely passionate about the work, who were working ridiculous hours because it didn't feel like work to them. They loved it. So they would have done that anyway, probably. If they could have got access to the tools and stuff without taking the paycheck, I'm sure they would have done it. And yeah, in the same organization, you also had one of these really trying to pick my words carefully, domineering, should we say, like authoritarian. That sort of boss is like, if you're not working 4 hours a day more than your minimum contract, then you're not working hard enough. That sort of mindset. Mm-hmm. And trying to balance those two between protecting from the one whilst encouraging the other. God, that's so difficult.
It is, but I think sometimes we then root it in some of these simple complexes, like what you just talked about, is happening a lot in consulting these days. And like I said, I'm so close to it that I can relate to it a lot. But what fascinates me is a lot of consulting companies are pushing this, well, you got to have a 45-hour work week. And I'm like, wait a second, but you're paying me for 40. Like I'm simplifying a lot of things there to shortcut the conversation. But the point being is 40 is not 45. 1 plus 2 does not equal 4, so to say. And part of this is, I think, goes to a little bit like what you're talking about in the sense of, I just need to push you harder, as if these people weren't working, consultants, contractors, a lot of them sometimes to go above and beyond, just like employees do to get the job done. And my point being is now you're telling them, well, you have to do it, as if they weren't doing it before. As if they weren't bringing that revenue into the organization before. Now you've dictated it. And it's just totally changed, and I think upended the relationship a little bit about what it means to be 45 hours billable in my example, and learn and join internal meetings. So you kind of get where I'm going with that a little bit.
Yeah, it stacks up really quick, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, there's so many of these concepts around this, aren't there, where I certainly was in terms of my work life, brought up to see these as good things, but actually, and sometimes they can be good things in the right context and with the right guardrails, to use your phrase, but also they can be quite toxic and harmful. So another one that popped into my mind as you were talking was, we have that phrase, we have a culture of over delivery, which sounds amazing to the customer, I'm sure. But if you stop and think about that, what does that mean? It means working 45 hours when you're paid for 40.
Not just that, like over delivery to give you something. It's almost like, I'm going to pump out more fries at the restaurant, even though you are done eating fries. It's an unlimited buffet, so to say. And keeping with that analogy, it's all the waste that comes from that as well. We tend to sometimes just do things for the sake of doing it, rather than actually really talking about the value it can bring to the organization or bring to the moment. And when it doesn't bring value, there's not just waste in that moment. Like I was using the restaurant buffet example. There is also a psychological element to it, as I did all this hard work and it just got thrown away. I spent 2 days making a PowerPoint and we didn't even look at it.
Yeah, I've definitely been there.
I'm not trying to dredge up some
triggered
feelings in there. But you get it. Like the resiliency also talks about the output. And I know we've been going on for a while here, but it is a key element of how we come forth into the world and how we represent ourselves to ourselves and others, like I was saying at the beginning. But part of that is the impact that comes from it. And so it's the value driven from it. So in the context of a work, if I'm just doing things for the sake of doing it, sure, I'm hitting a metric you've asked me to do, but it doesn't mean I'm actually making the organization more efficient or helping the organization drive towards its outcomes. It's almost like where we've gotten with Agile over the last few years, where it's just doing it for the sake of doing it, but not really getting after the true, I'm going to say, underlying principles of why people look to embrace Agile to begin with.
Yeah, it's a funny one, Agile, isn't it? Not to go off on another tangent or rant, but like I don't know about you, I've worked with quite a few people over the years who've just fundamentally misunderstood what it is. And I think
It's
they
still
stop
happening
at
these
that
days.
surface level. Like, what does agile mean in the dictionary? Like, oh, it means change direction quickly and easily. That's really not what agile is about. Anyway, I'm not going down that
Our
path.
conversation of resiliency, that is a basis of it, I think.
Yeah.
And I think what makes this topic so broad and so fascinating is we can go into these deep conversations in various aspects, both within our personal life, but in work. And there are a lot of things we tend to move towards bad habits, or we would flag as bad habits in those situations, or bad practices, depending on the way you want to look at it. And these all things have direct impacts on emotional state, have a direct impact on my willingness to be present or actively disengaged. All these kind of things that play a substantial role in building resiliency.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a good point, well made. So I'm slightly conscious of time. I mean, I could keep going for another hour, but maybe a couple more questions and then.
Yeah, let's do it. We'll do rapid fire session.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we've talked a lot around the reasons why it's important, about what it looks like, what it means, the problems around it. So if you were a relatively new leader today and you want to build in a bit more resilience to your organization, what are your top tips to help do that?
I'm going to give you one, and I think this is probably the most important one that we don't do enough. Listen. Go out to your teams. Listen. Don't walk around with the senior manager. Don't walk around with the manager that works for you. Go out and just meet the teams and listen. Be careful, because we've been talking about actions as well. Don't start actioning out all of the change to the people and not give your direct reports, the opportunity to engage with you on it. But just listen, stop there and just listen, and use that to reinforce what decisions you are making with your team to then drive, I'll say, greater resiliency and output from your organization. That's my one tip. We don't do enough of it.
I would certainly agree with that. And if I were to ask you, what's the biggest leadership lesson you've learned in your career, would it be the same answer?
Yes, but I would also say sometimes insert foot. I think it is a part of what I've learned a lot. And I think the biggest challenge I've actually had as an extension of that is really being vulnerable on the other side of it, because it is massively uncomfortable. When you're willing to go into a conversation where you got 100 people in front of you and somebody's asking you a very important question. And honestly, the answer is, I don't know, and I need to get back to you. And that can sometimes feel empty because follow through sometimes is lacking. But I think that's the extension of listening, and the extension of being present is really trying to drive vulnerability. It's hard. It's something you have to work on. And it's something that is very, is personal. It's no matter how many people you have up on that stage, somebody can tell from your interaction very quickly whether you're being genuine and whether you're being vulnerable. And as a leader, being vulnerable, I think, is the quickest way to driving trust, so long it's in a positive way.
Yeah, I think that was probably, as far back as my memory goes in life, when I was thinking about leadership, I think that was one of the first lessons that I learned, was if you don't know the answer, say that.
Yeah, we don't do it.
No, we don't. And it's this one of these biggest myths, isn't it, about leadership, is that you're the one who has to have the answer all the time. And I think that leads us down so many wrong paths of just, and I've said this before, I'm sure any long-time listeners, if there are any, will have heard me say this and are sick of hearing it. But it's that whole thing about if you think your job is to have the answer, then what that turns into in practice is any answer will do. It doesn't have to be the right one. You just have to have an answer. And especially when you're caught in like that kind of scenario where you maybe haven't prepared for that question because you didn't know it was coming, it's going to be whatever pops into your head first. That'll do. That's the answer. Good, done. Move on. And actually, it's so much more impactful and meaningful if you're just honest and vulnerable and say, yeah, I don't know the answer. Let me get back to you. And then again, you're so right. You've got to do the follow-up. You can't do one without the other. You've got to come back to them later and say, right, now I have the answer. Because otherwise it's just empty, as you said.
Yeah, and I'll add one element or tidbit to that. Let's say you are in front of 150 people and you're sweating bullets here. And maybe you've got some other colleagues that are on the stage with you, and maybe somebody does know the answer. What also doesn't happen often is, I'll say having a culture or an experience where people can step up into that moment and be ready to do it, one, but also willing to do it, two, and three, not be criticized for doing it. This is where we start to have this ripple effect of me being vulnerable as a leader and saying, I don't know, maybe, and Sue is standing there like, I got this, like leaning into Sue and saying, go for it, and being okay with it yourself. Like almost it's genuine because you're engaging with her and saying she's got it, or somebody in the crowd for that matter. Like the point being is vulnerability can display itself in a lot of different ways here to build the culture and the resiliency in the team. And it's hard for leaders, but if we have it and we work on that muscle, I talk a lot about muscles, work on a resiliency muscle, work on a vulnerability muscle, a trust, transparency. If we work on these muscles, they get better and stronger over time. And it really allows us to engage in a more authentic way with people.
Absolutely. And I think last thing I'll say about vulnerability, for me, it's essential to trust, because I've always seen it as like, when you are the leader, it's your responsibility to trust first if you expect to build trust with others. And a huge part of that has to be being vulnerable, because you are trusting them effectively with whatever it is you're being vulnerable about, whether it's I don't know the answer, or I'm feeling this way today, or I'm not too happy with how that turned out, what can we do next time, that sort of thing. You are displaying trust in them, and that has to be that first step towards building it as an organization. And as you said much earlier, trust is essential to resilience as well within a team or organization. So that's why it matters. That's why you should do it. And yes, it feels uncomfortable. Of course it does. No one's saying it's going to be easy, but that means it's important.
100%.
Yeah.
Leadership Heroes.
So if you had to pick one person, it could be anyone you like, alive or dead, past or present, real or even fictitious, but it has to be someone who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that person be for you, and why?
Oh, I think when you said perfectly, it was like that adjective that pushed me so far. Somebody I think that has exuded a lot of leadership in a moment of crisis in a lot of ways. And I still don't totally understand or appreciate it, because it's just still kind of going through the history books, and you could read countless ones, is Churchill. You step back for a second, and there are so many things he had to deal with, from motivating a nation, motivating allies, like just, getting after it, so to say, that whether he did it perfectly or not, I think that's for the history buffs to debate. But the point being is that I think he looked to move through it in a way that he saw best possible. And in many ways, his actions helped frame the outcomes. And like we talked about hindsight being 20/20, it could have gone a lot of different directions. It's like threading the needle with thread, and he did it right in that moment. And I think, there's a lot to be learned from that. And his personality has an element or dimension to it, and what that brought to the situation. But I think he definitely exuded a lot of leadership to get a lot of people that maybe trusted or didn't trust him to move in a way that needed to happen in the moment.
Funnily enough, his name comes up quite a lot in this question.
I don't know if it's because like you're on the other side of the pond for me, or what it
Possibly.
is, but But I think about it, and maybe it's because I'm also trying to relate to listeners, but it's just something top of mind for me that I've always, it's impressive to see how in moments of crisis people react, because that's when you see their true colors. And I think this is really where I'm going with it, is to say he's an easy example to show how he reacted under all this pressure, because let's be real, it wasn't easy. And I can't begin to appreciate what it means to run a country, let alone a country in that moment.
Yeah, true. I mean, he has a mixed reputation, I think it's fair to say.
Sure.
There was, he was, during that period of history, he was certainly, I don't think anyone would disagree on either side of that argument, he was the leader we needed. And there were key points during the war, I think, where his personality even, but certainly his decisions, his willpower even, like his mindset, his ability to just keep his head down and just get it done. I think that turned the tide of the war. I think that's fair to say. I mean, especially in terms of like his interactions with Roosevelt and bringing the States into the war and getting the aid that we needed and the whole Lend-Lease scheme, all of that. Anyway, I won't get into the history of it too much, but yeah, fair to say I agree with you. I think a lot of what he did though was it wasn't. I mean, he's known for the speeches, isn't he? I mean, that's
yes,
what made him famous. But actually, I mean, I don't think those really made any difference. A lot of the time, they were after the fact. I mean, yeah, they were inspirational. I'm sure they helped like the average person. But in terms of swaying the war, I think it was the things he was doing behind the scenes, the letters, the meetings, the decisions. And I think there's a great parallel. There's a great lesson there about leadership as a whole, isn't it? It's so often it's not about that overt stuff, the look at me sort of thing. It's about what you're doing behind the scenes. It's the influence. It's the quiet
action.
Yeah, the quiet action, the humility, all of those other nice words.
Yep.
Yeah. Which is,
you asked why. Perfect. Well, I think of no, but in all seriousness, I think that leaders, when they rise to the occasion, and it's always a hindsight thing because it could have gone a lot of different ways. And this is where we could, like you said, go deep on a different topic altogether, because there are two sides of that war. And people, are on both sides of it. And obviously we as a world went in a different direction than, we chose a side. And the point being here is he was a part of helping define that outcome. And that's what leadership is about. And it's being intentional around it. And it is not just helping people embody what it is you find important, but it's also creating that experience and that culture that can magnify the outcome. I mean, this is the essence of organizations, communities, so on and so forth. And so leaders are a big part of that. And
yeah, absolutely. He's an interesting figure. Yeah, we could go down a whole history podcast on that, couldn't we? But that's not what this one's about, sadly. So let's keep going on leadership. Well, Andrew, I think that's all the time we've got. Thank you so much for being with us today, especially given the time of day it is where you are as we record this. Much appreciated. Great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot as well about resilience and other things. So yeah, thank you. Last thing I will ask you, if anyone wants to learn more about you or your business, where can they go to learn more?
Well, you can find us on social media. We try to be active there, but in a conscious way, because it's important sometimes to disconnect, and that can be a part of resiliency. Just I think that's something to consider as one last tidbit for folks. But you can find us on social media. Beyond Platform is our handle, BEON platform. And I know we'll have it in the show notes and whatnot, but you can also hit us up at beyondplatform.com. Lots of ways to reach out, engage, find out what we're doing, follow us. And we're just excited to be here. David, thank you for the opportunity to really go in a lot of directions. And I really appreciate the listeners that took the time to spend it with us as we went in all of those tangents. So thank you.
Yeah, likewise, definitely. And yes, you are absolutely right. It will be in the show notes. So find the links down there somewhere. Awesome. Well, Andrew, have a great rest of your day.
Cheers. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you again so much for your time. Listeners and viewers, if you would like to learn more about Andrew, about Be.on, do check out the website and the social links that you'll find down there in the episode description in the show notes. As always, I encourage you to click on those and go and learn more about today's guest and his company, his business, what they do. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Really appreciate you being with us. I hope you found the episode useful and maybe at least a little bit entertaining, at least as much as I did anyway. Join us again next week for the final episode in our mini-series on resilience. And until then, start building those support networks, start thinking about your resilience strategy for your team, for the people you lead. And as always, be a leader, not a boss.